Hi everyone, welcome to the first ever episode of Demand Decoded. This is a brand new regular live event series that's going to discuss the core components of demand generation success. Thanks for being here today. We appreciate you taking your time out of the day to join us, so thank you very much. If you don't know us already, we're Blend. We're a B2B website and demand generation agency. So today, got Phil here, and him and I will be discussing the evolution of content marketing from gated to ungated content. As we go through, feel free to ask questions and we can answer them as we go along. Last time out, we had some really great questions that provided great value, some good conversation. So just drop them in the comments. We'll answer them as we go through or at the end. So yeah, don't be shy. I guess to kick us off, Phil, and to give us context for the rest of this discussion, it'd be good to outline what the actual difference is from our point of view between gated and ungated content.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's fortunately pretty simple. Gated content is going to be most of the time content that you only give away to your viewer, your visitor, or your reader in return for their contact information that you're probably going to process and store and use to market to them. So there's a form and they have to convert in order to receive that content, probably in a downloadable format, a PDF or a presentation or a document. Whereas on the other hand, an ungated piece of content is going to be visible to consume and read or see freely. A visitor to your website isn't going to have to convert, isn't going to have to submit a form, isn't going to have to give you their contact details in order to consume the information. So pretty simple distinction between the two in the majority of cases, I think.
Nice one. And I think the first thing to cover, and this was before my time at Blend, but obviously Blend went through the transition from gating content to ungating content some time ago. So I think it'd be really great to dive in to, your perspective on how that happened, why that happened, the impact of that, and all the ins and outs of transitioning.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting actually, and it all happened rather quickly in 2017. And Blend has always been focused on producing reliable results, executing marketing strategies and tactics that repeatedly and consistently produced beneficial outcomes. So we've always been on the hunt for things that did that most predictably. And 2016, 2017, we were doing content marketing, SEO, and inbound, as it was known. And we were observing that it was very effective at creating traffic and generating leads when you did those inbound behaviors of publishing ebooks, putting them behind forms, driving visitors to them with blog posts. And those behaviors would, as I said, drive traffic and leads pretty effectively. And they would also tend to correlate in the majority of cases with a modest but nonetheless measurable increase in buyers that came to you via your website and expressed an interest in what you had to offer. But it was usually on the smaller end of the scale. Now, we also observed that if you improved the user experience of your website, you could dramatically increase the number of buyers that appeared and raised their hand and asked to talk to you, as you executed those inbound behaviors. So you could produce a really, really beneficial output. But what was interesting was that those two groups, the leads on the one hand that downloaded your content and the buyers that just appeared and expressed an interest in what you had to offer, hardly overlapped at all, sometimes not at all. Leads didn't become buyers and buyers didn't first become leads before expressing interest to buy. And furthermore, no amount of effort spent trying to sort of iterate on lead nurturing approaches and lead scoring models made a measurable, reliable impact on that conversion rate from lead to buyer. So we were looking at this data and we were sort of thinking, well, this is interesting. We've got all this content that fundamentally our buyers are not seeing. We've got these really popular downloads that are being downloaded hundreds of times, but our buyers are not seeing it. And everything is optimized around essentially paying to store the contact information of people who are most likely not going to go on to purchase in the next couple of years. We're paying to have a system that stores their information and allows us to market to them via email and other channels. And that sort of started to feel very, very ludicrous, really, given what was happening with those two cohorts. And then around about the same time, the final sort of penny dropped, which was HubSpot published their research into topic clusters and pillar pages as an SEO strategy. And suddenly, we realized, like many, all of this great content that we've gated and we've optimized for generating contact details could also be the heart of a very effective SEO strategy for us. So pretty much overnight, the decision was made to ungate all of that content, offer it for free to anybody that came to our website, allow buyers to see it, allow Google to see it, and allow people to download it only if they really wanted to take a copy away for later reference.
And I think when it comes to the actual transition period, it's worth saying that it was easier for Blend, right? Because ultimately you were making the decision, you were ungating it, instead of gating it, whereas it's not so easy for everyone else in a larger organization, maybe.
No, absolutely. We were consciously aiming to move what we measured elsewhere, further down the funnel. Fundamentally, we wanted high intent buyers expressing an interest, but of course lots of businesses are going to be really focused on and even sort of measuring and KPIing parts of their business on leads generated via things like content, MQLs produced as a result of content downloads followed by lead nurturing, emails, and so on. And while those measurements are at the heart of a group's sort of perceived success, then the shift to ungated content is going to be more challenging, because you're not going to be optimized for driving those metrics anymore. You're going to be driving metrics that are elsewhere in the pipeline, in the funnel, and further away. Now, they're much better metrics, they're far more beneficial for your business, but nonetheless it can take time and energy to reach a new set of agreements around what that should look like.
Yeah, nice. So obviously, like, Blend made the shift from gated to ungated content, and you've touched on a few of them, but can we just outline what are the actual fundamental issues with it?
With gated content?
With gating content.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, the fundamental, the most critical issue is that buyers increasingly are avoiding downloading content like that because of what it leads to, because of the giving away of their privacy, because of the enrolling in workflows and sequences and emails and all the lead nurturing events that come afterwards. So even more than in 2017, actual serious buyers are circumventing that whole part of your sort of marketing journey. And critically, if your buyers are not seeing it, they're not able to infer your credibility, your expertise, your knowledge on the subject from it, because they haven't got the ability to see it. And so the people who are seeing it are not likely to enter your pipeline, and the people who are likely to enter your pipeline are not going to be building trust and affinity with your brand as a result of it. So that's the biggest flaw we've got there.
And on the flip side of that, then, from the benefit side of things, when we're going from gated to ungated content, what are the fundamental benefits of ungating?
I think the biggest benefit is trust. The trust that you can drive and achieve by letting buyers see that content, see your knowledge laid out without having to give away their contact details for it. Because of course, if they can consume that content, they can build, trust, affinity, preference for you based on it, without having to open themselves up to lead nurturing emails, cold calls, and the like. In addition, you've got that SEO benefit, which is if that content is adapted for search engine optimization, Google can now index that content, which it can't do when it's in a PDF behind a form. It can rank it potentially for a pretty competitive short tail term, something informational. And with your blog posts and your social content leading into it, it can really boost your traffic numbers overall. And the two sort of feed into one another, a virtuous cycle, if you like, because you'll be discovered by more people view and consume the content freely and make a decision to inquire. So that can those two things drive one another to even greater levels.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about ungated content as a whole, rather than just one piece, ungating everything removes a lot of that friction from going back to consuming lots of your content and multiple pieces. If you've got 10 ebooks behind gates, or 10 pillar pages, or 10 videos, or 10 podcasts, they're much easier to consume with less friction rather than filling out a form 10 times to then get a piece of content.
Yeah, I mean, that user experience is not a good one and isn't likely to increase consumption. And furthermore, I think if you adopt this ungated content mindset, it's far easier to repurpose and utilize that content across a broader set of channels, making it even easier for buyers to discover and consume it where they are, at the point in time that they're interested, if you like. So yeah, I think by having all of your content visible and not behind a form each and every time, you are creating more flexibility for the buyer and more possibility for them to discover and see it.
Yeah. I don't know what's going on with my webcam, by the way, but hopefully I can get it in focus. Right, I think that's working. Because another point that I really like to make around the gated versus ungated debate is that aside from all of the commercial impacts and benefits that it has, the actual benefit of being a marketer utilizing ungated content is so relieving and freeing, and the creativity that you can then put into content is much greater than being on the hamster wheel of creating an ebook, setting up a landing page, setting up a thank you page, setting up a 5 email nurture sequence, adding it to the lead scoring system. And it just pushes the boundaries of what you can actually do with marketing, open up new channels, new opportunities, just the opportunity to be more creative with marketing and fundamentally enjoy what you're doing more.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. It's definitely more freeing and more satisfying to create and publish content freely. And in addition, ultimately you're then contributing to the creation of opportunity because you're optimizing for high intent conversions elsewhere, but closer to pipeline, which is a much more valuable and sort of reliable end goal, if you like. And so I think that brings sales and marketing alignment closer together, produces a more exciting and thrilling outcome, and does let you get on with the job of creating great content without worrying about all those, hoops you got to make people jump through. And, to go back to the sort of earlier point in the discussion, when Blend decided to ungate all of our content, we had spent real time and effort pouring all of our best knowledge into these downloads that were being downloaded frequently, hundreds of times. They were really, really good pieces of content. Making those public, visible to all, felt like a really good change to make because of the energy that we put into them. So yeah, it did come with its benefit of creating greater satisfaction as well as greater results for us as a team.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a takeaway. If you are considering the switch from gated to ungated, don't just consider the commercial elements, but actually consider the relief from a marketer, right?
Yeah, and we shouldn't sort of overlook the importance of, if you're struggling with this decision, analyzing the source of your opportunities, because for us and for most of the clients that we executed content marketing, inbound and SEO for, and for some other, very well-known businesses that I've spoken to, there is this stark difference between who your leads are and who goes on to convert. And and it lasts for multiple years in most cases. And so breaking down your pipeline and your sources of opportunity like that, and really understanding what's driving them, helps, I think, to build the desire to make this shift.
Yeah, and that is documented quite well, actually. Split funnel analysis is the term generally used for looking at that. So like if you are considering the switch again, looking for a data point to back that up, just search somewhere, even Blend's YouTube, for split funnel analysis, if I can say it. And you'll find some content on how to do that. Before we go any further, Trevor has asked a question. I'll try and dissect this. So how do you see ungated debate relative to non-marketer job title target prospects? So I suppose, how would people that aren't marketers, well, let's take this as, how do we see gated versus ungated content affecting people that aren't marketers? Well, Trevor, just pop in the comments if we've
misunderstood
that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this applies more or less universally, right? And most of our clients' target audience are not marketers. Ours potentially are, although not all the time. But for our customers, it's certainly not the case, right? And buyers, humans, are all going through the same broad set of experiences currently, which is spam is on the increase, prospecting is on the increase, cold call, email, LinkedIn, InMail, all these things are, being driven up and up and up in an attempt to maintain naturally declining performance in most cases. The numbers, the stats that are being shared around the success rate, the connect rate, the meeting rate of prospecting, they're not terribly encouraging. So everything's on the up. And as buyers, we're all confronted with that same thing. So I think buyers in nearly all industries will prefer to discover and consume content in a sort of organic, private, privacy first, anonymous mode, rather than repeatedly and frequently submit their contact information and convert in order to get information which, prior to seeing, you have no idea of what level it's at or what quality it's of. And so this move to ungated content as a sort of first principle, with potentially download as an option, is, I think, has got merits broadly, widely, not just when you're targeting marketers.
Yeah, and Trevor did follow up, and I think we have understood. So Blend is targeting marketers, but lots of other companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like in cybersecurity or IT, and it's definitely worth saying that this isn't just for marketers. Like, buyers are humans. We're all the same. We all like to do similar things, consume content the same ways. We get fed up of the same things. So it's not just relevant to the marketing industry, but actually, much more.
The epiphany, I suppose, that we had in 2017 was absolutely not the result of looking only at our own data and performance. We were looking at a range of clients, specifically ones in cloud IT and SaaS, and also conversations that we were having with a very big orange company at the time about what they saw, within their pipeline. So there were a variety of sources, and we, implemented this for ourselves and for our customers, and we still do, with the same effects. So yeah, definitely think it applies broadly, and it can work in cybersecurity and IT just as well as it can work in, marketing.
Love it.
Good question.
Right, we're being inundated with questions here. Richmond, this is great. Keep them coming. Phil, I'll let you take this one, I think, because we definitely have a stance. How do you recommend measuring the impact of your content without relying on form fills to track engagement?
Of course, there's a ton of metrics available to you to assess the impact of a piece of content in terms of its ability to get in front of people, drive engagement, and so on. So, you can obviously, most pillar content is going to be aimed at a keyword or another. So it's worth tracking your position, using the tools that are available for that, looking at your visitor numbers, looking potentially at your time on page, looking at your traditional engagement metrics. But the big win is further down the buying journey. It's high intent leads. Now, some would call them MQLs, but MQLs comes with a lot of preconceptions around their lead scored, or they're still in the marketing part of the phase, but we think they're good enough for sales. I'd advocate for classifying, MQLs right at the bottom of the funnel, like expressing an interest, raising a hand. And if you ungate your content and you link it well with your blog content and your social channels and your strategy, you're going to be creating, let's say, higher velocity, less friction towards the bottom of your funnel. So you should be able to measure it in terms of high intent leads or MQLs or opportunities created sourced by marketing and some other things that reflect that sort of more revenue based set of measurements. Whilst you can still look at visitor numbers, you can look at downloads if it's optional, and you can look at position for keywords to gauge the impact of your individual pillar pieces.
Yeah. And self-reported attribution also definitely plays a part in that.
Self-reported attribution is brilliant. Down at that bottom of the funnel area where people are expressing an interest, self-reported attribution can give you insight into the thing that created the desire to get in touch, and that is very often going to be different from what your software attribution is going to tell you, right? It's like Google or PPC is not the spark that created the desire to get in touch with you, but it could very well be a comprehensive piece of content that you published on, cybersecurity, to take the previous question as an example. So yeah, there's a variety of ways still to measure impact all the way across the buyer journey, but just measuring contacts generated, leads, downloads, isn't really conducive to the bigger goal of revenue.
Yeah. I think the point on form fills is, like you kind of mentioned, Phil, you are actually still measuring a form fill at the end of the day. You're just not measuring the content form fill, you're measuring the high intent form fill. And you're looking for, a combination of software and self-reported attribution to tell you which pieces of content and which channels brought them there.
Yeah. And as we often say, it's always worthwhile reflecting on what you yourself would do during a purchase decision, and aligning our actions towards what buyers like us want from vendors, which is usually not forcing me to fill in a form to download a piece of content to be on the receiving end of a load of spam.
Yeah. This question from Daniel is a bit of a long one. I think we can probably split this up into two parts, and it also covers our faces, but that's not a bad thing. Right, let's take this in two parts. So what are some ways you can articulate to the non-marketing decision? This kind of covers something we were going to talk about later, which is great, but some ways you can articulate to the non-marketing decision makers in a company about this shift from marketing as a driver of leads to a driver of engagement.
Well, to your point, when we sort of chatted about this beforehand, the change to an ungated approach at a tactical level is rather straightforward. It doesn't have to be hard. These pages don't need to be highly designed, highly developed, to achieve the objective. But switching it at a stakeholder level, at a strategic level, can be more challenging, and there can be more resistance. I wouldn't necessarily say that engagement is quite the right word to use, because engagement is such a sort of, maybe it's a bit of a light metric. What we're looking to generate is really high intent conversions. We're looking to generate pipeline from our content efforts. And I think it always serves to do that split funnel analysis at the outset to try to show senior stakeholders just how clear it is in most cases that the pipeline is coming from people who avoid the content conversion path, and it is not coming from the leads that are converted and then nurtured and then scored. And we'll probably do a whole other session on the problems with lead scoring, but it's not unusual for lead scoring to become a mixture of actual high intent leads that did one thing that made them an MQL, filled in the bottom of the funnel form for a demo, a trial, a consultation, and a bunch of other scored leads that never go anywhere. So yeah, analyzing what's happening already is usually a way to build a clear enough story, a clear enough picture to drive the shift to this approach. Now, to your point, Dan, if your business already has a large team of salespeople, of SDRs and AEs who are reliant on high volumes of leads to get the job done, you've got another challenge. If you're an SME that's building up, it's probably going to be quite straightforward, and you can then run a smaller sales team focused on really high quality, high intent, warm conversations. If your SDR team is driven by leads at present, this approach probably will affect your lead generation numbers. Funnily enough, when we did it, we didn't actually see a huge decrease in lead generation because content was being seen by more people, and the option to download it was still being taken by a similar amount of people overall. But nonetheless, you might have to look at how you keep those SDRs supplied while this strategy increases the number of leads that are ready to talk to sales and ready to enter the pipeline.
Yeah, like we're not advocating for a tool like Zoom Info or something like that to buy data, but it's likely you'll have to either do some major, well, not major, but some kind of internal restructuring for multiple departments, not just marketing, and change a few things fundamentally.
We're not alone in advocating for a shift, I don't think, which is to say that businesses the world over are spending huge amounts on prospecting, on ad-driven lead generation with diminishing returns. And, diminishing returns to Blend is always a reason to look for a new approach before the returns, ebb away to almost nothing. So I think there's some hard conversations that, would have to be had for sure. But I am advocating for a fresh look at this because I know when the phone rings, I'm not usually interested in hearing what's being pitched on the other end. When the email comes in, same. That's not part of my buying journey in the majority of cases, and I don't think I'm alone.
Yeah. Right, let's take this other part. So relatedly, how do you measure, I feel like we might have covered this a bit beforehand, but how do you measure the traditional ROI metrics from content that's ungated? Is it merely asking buyers who come to you about what they liked and read / watched, listened to?
Well, feel free to take this if you want to, Dan, but ROI from content I think has always been hard to measure because that you're writing 3,000 words and hoping to produce a result which isn't measured in how many words were read, I suppose. But fundamentally, I think the ROI of content needs to move away from leads generated, number of leads generated, who then go on to be nurtured and scored, to amount of pipeline created from the marketing channels, if you like. So how much pipeline was the result of conversions via the website, that is driven by the content strategy, and how much of that goes on to close, become revenue, and how fast. And so those are some of the ways that you can look at the ROI of the effort overall. But I think, we are obsessed with performance-driven marketing, and as buyer behavior sort of changes in favor of privacy and anonymity, and as the world in which we operate evolves, it's going to become harder and harder to measure marketing performance at a granular level. And actually, Rand Fishkin at SparkToro was talking about that just the other day on LinkedIn, about how actually we are seeing a bit of a decline in the measurability of marketing. Brand marketing is becoming so important, but we have to sort of build an understanding and a philosophy that our goal is the pipeline, and we do things that logically drive it.
Yeah, I would add that when you move from gated to ungated content, you're less focused on the ROI of individual pieces of content and more focused on the ROI of channels more broadly. So like, again, going back to the self-reported attribution, software attribution argument, like you would be looking at self-reported attribution for somebody to say like, I saw you, you know, at this event, for example, or like, you know, software attribution might tell you that they read a blog. And so there are ways to do it, but yeah, you're looking more broadly rather than at ROI of, you know, particular pieces.
Yeah.
Cool. This is a funny one because I think the answer is basically yes, but does it need to be one or the other? You could create a pillar page and then give the opportunity to download and take away hard to read stuff on a screen sometimes. So yeah, so before we do these events, like yesterday, me and Phil, you know, were chatting about what we're going to talk about today. And I think we probably spoke about this exact point for about half an hour, going around the houses on this. It is just such an interesting point on how you actually approach this. So I think, go on, Phil.
From my perspective, I think it's always sensible to offer people a downloadable version of something, because there are situations and there are mediums where it's preferable, right? So making things easy for buyers, removing friction, is a big part of what we do. So I think having that, and if you go to our pillar pages, you'll find that nearly all of them, if not all of them, are available to download as an option. The question is then, do you use that download as a means of gathering contact data? And this is where we had a bit of a debate. And I think you can argue it either way. Where I ended up settling was that there is no harm in generating an audience of people who want to be in your audience and who want to receive information like the information they're consuming presently. Now, as long as you don't get sort of confused about who they are, as in they are not people who are probably going to buy from you in the next 1 or 2 years in most cases, and therefore how you treat them as a contact, as a piece of data in terms of what you send them and when and why, I think as long as you act cautiously and with respect there, you can use optional download as a way to generate an audience who can be, you know, part of your sort of amplification tools, if you like. You know, they can share your content, they can spread the word, and they can be engaged with your business over a long period of time, but just don't expect to be able to nurture them through the purchase process over, you know, 3 or 5 emails and turn them into a buyer, because, you know, that we've just not seen work out.
Yeah, if you are set on gating content and requiring data to do that, like, first of all, like, go careful with the amount of data that you're actually asking for in the first place. And I suppose just be aware that the people downloading your content, whilst they are, you know, yes, they are subscribing to receive data from you, probably from a privacy notice or something on your form, they aren't aware that they're going to get 5 follow-up emails or, you know, a newsletter 4 times a week. So yeah, just take caution with what you send them and what you do with that email address, because, you know, the chances are they're probably not actually expecting or maybe wanting to receive anything from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. This next one from Stephanie. Thanks for the question. Are there any exceptions to your ungated strategy? Again, something like we spoke about yesterday. For example, high value and high intent analyst reports like Gartner and Forrester.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because the value of the content doesn't actually change the fundamental truth, which is that in most cases, buyers respond well to not being forced to convert on content. You know, that said, we did discuss things like Gartner's Magic Quadrant, and I have seen them used as an effective lead generation tool. But I suppose actually it's dawned on me, in some industries, that is the bottom of the funnel high intent conversion, which is to say, you know, when you've got a piece of content that is of the value and of the quality that Gartner produces on an industry, people who download that are, to some degree, in the purchase cycle. And if they download that from a company that are in the quadrant, then that company stands a very high chance of being on the shortlist of who will be contacted anyway. So what I'm saying is that I don't think it's necessary for any business to, simply because a piece of content contains first-party data or really high-value analysis, that doesn't necessitate a shift back to gating it, because back to gating it just means people can't see it, people can't consume it, people can't trust it until they give away their privacy. And buyers, I think, are increasingly going to, resist giving away their privacy. But in situations like Gartner Magic Quadrant, Forrester Wave, you might see that actually that is a piece of content that's so close to the purchase decision that it effectively becomes the high intent conversion, the bottom of the funnel, and you can gate it with some success. Interesting.
Yeah. I don't think I have much more to add on that one. Trevor responded again from off the back of our original questions he sent in. And so in-person events trigger lots of terribly ineffective and untargeted follow-up sequences. I agree wholeheartedly. Do you see the decline or reimagining of that marketing channel? And I suppose, well, events aren't, typically gated content, but do you see the decline or reimagining of that marketing channel?
Event marketing is not something that we're, an expert in. We are mainly focused on creating inbound pipeline, right, from content. But what we see is that events are shifting and evolving rapidly. There's a lot more focus on live content being shared freely, without pre-registration required, without joining a platform or so on. And there's there are some shifts taking place in live events, face-to-face events as well. Not least the digital move that COVID brought about. But it's just interesting that there are so many marketing behaviors that do produce just a ton of really ineffective and unwelcome interruptions. And I think buyer behavior is going to drive them all to change over the coming few years. And there are, a range of very, very smart, well-known people talking about different ways to make events part of your new era marketing, I suppose, part of your demand generation marketing. And I think, it is less reliant on conversions and it's less reliant on follow-up emails to achieve the end goal. And it's more reliant on giving information and knowledge freely to build affinity, to build brand, and relying on that to get more buyers into your pipeline over the longer term than on getting leads into your CRM short term.
Yeah, and I think going back to the measurement metric reporting point, ultimately, if your marketing is measured on pipeline and revenue, you're probably not really too bothered about, following up with some nurture sequence off the back of an event, because the value is actually speaking to those people at the event, talking about your product solution, their problems, building that connection, building that affinity. So ultimately, you're not going to be scanning badges for a few details, because that's not what you're interested in and what your goal is at the end of the day. It's much further down the funnel.
Yeah.
Cool. Got this one in from Sally. Hi, Sally. I hope you're well, by the way. Does the argument still apply, moving away from gate content, if you're gating content, but only drop people into a nurture if they have opted in to receive comms on the form? So essentially, people can still view the content without the fear of receiving marketing if they don't opt in, but those who want to opt in can still do so.
So gating the content, but giving people the freedom, which, some privacy laws basically made mandatory, to agree or disagree to receiving the follow-up communication. I mean, I think the fundamental problem with that is that you're still hiding that content from people until they've converted. And more buyers will simply say, nah, I can go elsewhere and I can get that information other ways. That information will be available in some format elsewhere, be it on LinkedIn, be it via ChatGPT, be it via another vendor. There's a large proportion of buyers that are going to say, no, thank you, even if the toggle is there. And so when it comes to, selective opt-in and, check this box to do that, check, opt-into communication, opt-out communication, I see those as being, there's of incremental impact either way. I mean, ultimately what GDPR kind of did is accelerate the sort of the shift in email marketing's efficacy and impact, right? Because if you take a consent-based approach to email marketing and you have to ask for consent every time, you are basically saying that it's okay for a large percentage of people who download your content to not opt into email, meaning you can't communicate with them after the fact anyway. So why get them to download and convert in the first place? Now, you know who they are, you've got their contact details, but you've got to wrestle with the questions of, do I have permission to process this information? Do I have permission to call and email them? What can I do with it? But you are almost certainly paying to store it and paying to have it in your systems. So I don't think it changes the fundamental challenge, which is increasingly we see buyers bypassing the whole content download process, regardless of what control they're offered along the way.
Yeah, I think there might be a slight twist. Like if your opt-in is explicitly, we are going to send you an email newsletter at 2 p.m. every Monday and do this and do that, outlining exactly what you're going to do. I'm not sure I see any harm in doing that, to be honest. As long as the person can opt out of that and it's optional.
I think the thing you've got to be really wary of is the fact that buyers are now confronted with checkboxes and opt-in buttons, several times a minute, expecting them to pore over your small text to understand what you're offering them in a checkbox is perhaps a little bit hopeful and unrealistic. And I'm all for taking the simplest approach to getting the most buyers into conversation with you. And for me, that is ungate the content, let them consume it freely, and literally watch as you get more of them raising their hands at the bottom of the funnel to talk to sales.
Yeah, cool. So whilst we've maybe still got Sally, if we just cover her other question, would we say lead nurturing and lead scoring are now out of date and ineffective? Go on, Phil, take it away.
Is lead nurturing via email anyway? Is it anything more other than spam nowadays? Most of it goes into some other inbox that I don't look at. Most of it goes unread, and receiving emails doesn't have an impact on my progress towards making a purchase decision. That's not how I'm influenced, and I don't think that's how buyers are influenced. So I think lead nurturing is pretty out of date strategy because it's not getting the responses that we want. Single digit click open and click rates is not very exciting. And lead scoring, I mean, we've talked about this certainly in some of our content, and we'll probably talk about it here in the future. But yeah, it's just a broken idea, because to score leads, you're relying on behaviors correlating with intent to purchase something in a consistent manner, and they do not. And so most lead scoring is sort of misguided guesswork, which ends up being sort of gamed by the team so that the good leads go with the bad leads over to the sales team. But the real results are getting masked in that process. We'll have to do a whole event on lead scoring, won't we?
Yeah, and I'll send you a survey, like a report that we found, Sally, which showed that 81% of customers said they wouldn't. Well, I think this was like 2021, so it's moved on a bit. 81% of customers said they wouldn't decide to download content because of a form, and 39% said they would enter fake information. So I'll send you a link to that.
So like all these strategies are focused on sort of manipulating the minority of an audience rather than serving the needs of the majority. And so I think that's where the difference comes. If we can do, if we can do marketing in ways that gives the majority more, we're going to get better results.
Yeah, and sorry, a point on this as well, being out of date. I think just the way that people consume content and the evolution of that has rapidly evolved and expanded. So the ebook that you had 3 years ago is now a podcast. It's now 6 YouTube videos, and people have more access to that ungated, and there's not much need for them to pass over the details that they don't want to pass over just to get some content they can get elsewhere.
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely.
Cool. Let's go to Jennifer next. We're majorly overrunning, by the way, but this is just great. So let's keep it going. So if you're not nurturing by email and phone, how are you following up with people who are interested in your content? Inviting them to follow you on LinkedIn at the end of the content piece, or using targeted ads to website visitors?
Well, we're not fundamentally, right? Which can, I know, take some time to sort of comprehend. But people who are interested in our content may not be people who can or will buy from us in the near future. So the fact that we're no longer getting a download, meaning we can't follow up and say thank you, and we can't send a LinkedIn request, and we can't send them 3 or 5 sequenced nurturing emails, doesn't bother us, because that's not what we're optimizing for. We're optimizing for people freely, willingly entering the pipeline, when ready, as a result of built awareness, built trust, built preference, built affinity with our brand of what we do and our clients' brands of what they do. Ultimately, the efforts that are spent, sending LinkedIn requests as a result of a lead being generated, sending lead nurturing emails, scoring behaviors, and so on, are having diminishing returns. And there's lots of energy spent and lots of money spent trying to hold up, I think, the results from that kind of approach when all the forces are in the opposite direction. The free availability of content, the tools that enable us to preserve our inbox sanity, our preference for privacy, the laws that are being implemented to enforce our privacy, and so on and so forth. So I think we are seeing and we are supporting a shift away from that whole strategy. Like we said, if you've got an SDR team who are fed by leads, then you've got potentially additional challenges to explore and address. But the future is, I think, a future of free consumption, brand affinity, and willing conversion at the bottom of the funnel. Yeah. Now, PPC, promotion of content, and PPC is a valid channel still for creating demand in certain situations and for capturing it. So using PPC to be where your buyers are when they're taking action along their buying process is still valid and viable. Of course, remarketing is going through huge change at the moment because third-party cookies are going away, and we're going to have to wait for the big platforms to come up with new ways of identifying audiences and targeting them. But PPC can still play a role in both creating some demand, promoting your content to your ICP on LinkedIn, where they can choose whether to engage with it or not, by and to capture some of that demand by paying to be amongst the search results, prior to your SEO getting you there naturally, or even when it does. So PPC still runs alongside everything that we're talking about, but not the sort of, shall we say, traditional SDR toolkit of let's connect, let's send an email, let's put you in a workflow or a sequence. Those things aren't aligned to what we're advocating for.
Yeah, ultimately, I think as well to add, if your content is ungated and easy to access, then in an ungated approach, you don't need any follow-up for them to then access another piece of content. You don't need to send them a case study or, the next piece in your sequence, because they can just access that freely in the way that they want to, in their preferred method. So actually having no follow-up is probably beneficial from a buyer's perspective.
Absolutely.
Cool. Question from Cara. How would you know if the right people are finding and reading your content if you aren't getting conversions and they are just researching? Would you need lead forensics type software in place?
Well, you don't know much when you take a ungated approach to content in terms of who's arriving there. But let's not forget that, our whole marketing strategy is based on, or should be based on, knowing who our ideal customer is and who our target audience is, and creating the content they want and need at the different stages of the buying process. So, operating on that understanding, but doing content in an ungated way versus a gated way, still is aimed at bringing the right person into your site. Okay, so you're not going to convert them into a lead just for an ebook so that you can tick and say, yeah, they were in our ICP. But doing that is so harmful anyway to your results, later down the line, that it doesn't become a beneficial step to take. So you can, of course, use SEO software to understand what terms your content is likely to be found for. And of course, those terms are a really good indicator of the thinking and the areas of interest of the visitors coming in. And of course, you're still going to get conversions, probably more of them where it matters, at the book a demo, book a consultation, contact us stage. And you can measure those to make sure they're in your ICP, that they're in the right audience groups and so on and so forth. And ultimately, most people who do read your content that would have been gated, many of them will be researching. Some of them will be students, some of them will be competitors, some of them will be your peers. A large majority of them are just researching, and that's why it's so sort of ineffective to turn them into a lead and then try to nurture them. They're not looking to purchase. Lead forensics and other tools that give you the IP addresses of companies that have visited your website might be a sensible solution to making that shift for that SDR team that have come from a high volume lead environment as you move away from the gated content approach. But it's not something that we advocate for, because again, most of the people that you might call as a result of lead forensics identifying their company by IP address are not likely, in the majority, to be willing, excited to receive your call and willing to discuss what you're talking about offering, which is why the connect rates and the success rates of prospecting and the calling are so low.
Yeah. And I think as well, just to expand on the first point, how do you know if the right people are finding and reading your content? Ask them, ask the actual people that matter most. Yes, you aren't gonna have attribution on, every single person that's downloaded a piece of content that's read it, but you will have attribution on high intent buyers, customers. So, use self-reported attribution, use customer research, talk to customers, see if they like what you're putting out there, if they're engaging with it. And if they are, the chances are the rest of your market and audience is also going to like that content as well, and you're doing the right thing.
I should say that, for us and for the clients where we implement this, we talked earlier about the fact that content very reliably increases traffic and leads when it's gated. It correlates with an increase in ready to purchase inquiries too, and you can dramatically increase that if the user experience of your website is effective. And I see that as creating like an easy journey for the buyer, from all the way from discovery to decision. when we move from gated to ungated, we see an increase in the number of high intent leads that are generated. That's pretty universal. So it's not like you're going to have to do this with no signs of positive impact and success for long, because you will at the bottom of your funnel. And I do think of this ungating your content using topic cluster pillar page strategy for the SEO side of things is part of creating a really easy journey, all the way to your pipeline for your buyer. And you can measure that very nicely at the point at which they raise their hand and express their interest.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I think we probably covered everything that we wanted to cover through the questions anyway. Yep. So let's wrap it up there. This has been the first episode of Demand Decoded. If you did find it helpful, we'd really like to know. This is going to become a regular series, bi-weekly to start with. So yeah, let us know. We'd love to hear the feedback and, learn from that. And hopefully see you on the next one. Be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page for the future events. And yeah, thanks for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. Hopefully see you next time. Thanks.